Now we get to move into the question of the implications of counterterrorism. I'm Jeff Feltman. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Brookings Institution, and it's an honor to be on the stage with such distinguished panelists. There's a lot of discussion in the last session about preventing violent extremism, countering violent extremism, and Josh, maybe you're the author of this, but when I was at the UN a few years ago, the Obama administration put a lot of pressure on then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to come up with a report to member states about best practices, about preventing violent extremism. It was extraordinarily difficult to pull this off, partially because of the substance. As you heard from the earlier panel, what works, what are best practices in reality on preventing violent extremism? It was a very hard question to deal with. But it was also extraordinarily difficult because of the politics inside the United Nations. You know, we were the Secretariat. We were putting together this report. But the member states were watching us with incredible scrutiny. For a couple reasons. One is that they saw the Preventing Violent Extremism report by the Secretary General as basically being an invitation for the UN or other member states to interfere in the domestic policies of individual member states. If we're saying you shouldn't disenfranchise entire segments of your population for fear that you could radicalize them, that means we're passing judgment on what states were doing. So that was hard. But the other part, the other reason why it was so difficult was because there were some states that were really concerned that we started to question the implications of their counterterrorism policies. Were there counterterrorism policies that actually created terrorists? And so I'm very interested to hear this panel talk about the implications of counterterrorism policy, because it had a real practical impact on the work we were doing at the United Nations to fulfill a U.S. request to develop a report on preventing violent extremism. The three panelists here bring a lot of experience and different perspectives, crossing from academic and research to government experience, and looking at different regions of the world and how they interact on counterterrorism. James Baker at the far end is a visiting fellow in governance study, here at Brookings. But he's also had a very distinguished career in government, including 4 years as the general counsel for the FBI. And he's worked on a number of national security matters that are of relevance for our discussions today, including the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And he also headed the former Office of Intelligence Policy and Review, which was part of the Department of Justice, became part of the Department of Justice's National Security Division. Dr. Ji-Hyang, who just traveled here from South Korea for this policy, is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East and North Africa Center at the Azan Institute for Policy Studies. And if you look at the Azan Institute's website, as I did in preparation, and you look at the areas that this nonpartisan think tank in Seoul covers, it reminded me of Brookings, all the different sorts of areas that you cover at Azan. But Dr. Jang has worked in particular on researching the Middle East, the political economy, political Islam in the Middle East and North Africa, how this relates to democratization, to terrorism, to state building, and she's the author of a number of books and articles on this issue about the Middle East and North Africa. And then immediately to my right is Professor Zachary Abuza, who's a professor at the National War College in Washington, and he has focused on South Asian politics and security issues, including questions that have come up in the early discussions on governance and insurgencies, human rights, maritime security. He too is a well-published author with 5 books and a number of other studies on this issue. So I am again honored to be here to moderate this panel, and as with the previous session, each of them will speak for 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about CT. I've been asked to focus on the issues related to civil liberties, privacy, and human rights. And so some folks might find it ironic that the former general counsel of the FBI is getting up talking about that particular topic, but actually I've spent a significant amount of my career worrying about those kinds of issues. And indeed, I've said before that I actually think of myself in a significant way as a privacy lawyer, because that's been part of my responsibilities. So I'm most definitely not an Asia expert, so don't expect that from me. But so what I think I'll be bringing that I think is transferable in a variety of different contexts is some of the ideas, I guess, concepts that I've learned dealing with these issues in the United States before and after 9/11, and some of the ways that we've approached it, and at least reflections about how I think about it. And I'll also come at it from the perspective of, in my career, of having done both, having conducted and been responsible for assisting the conduct of counterterrorism operations, helping the operators achieve their objectives, and then also being responsible for conducting oversight of those activities through a variety of different means. And so I'll try to merge those together and give you some reflections, perhaps some lessons learned, and with a focus on trying to synthesize some of the things that I've learned. But I know in the audience it seems as though we have a range of different types of experiences. So some people have been doing this for a long, long time and are very well versed in how to deal with counterterrorism operations, and perhaps people who are less so. So if I can start out with this metaphor that I like to use to give folks a sense, folks who have not actually been involved in counterterrorism operations before, to give them a sense of what it's like, and then that I think will help us think about, helps me think about how to conduct oversight of those activities to make sure that privacy, civil liberties, human rights are being perspective. So if I could just start out for a minute and talk about, and I think this kind of merges some of the things that we talked about before in the first panel. So let me talk about counterterrorism and soccer for a moment, okay? Or football, for those of you who refer to it as football. So counterterrorism and soccer. So a lot of people have used the metaphor that the objective of counterterrorism officials is like the goalie on a soccer team, and they have to stop every single shot at the goal and make sure that no shot scores, because if the opponents take 100 shots and the goalie stops 99 of them, the one shot that gets through is a disaster for the counterterrorism officials, right? Okay, so that is true, but it is way, way worse than that if you're conducting counterterrorism operations, way worse than that. Because, here's at least how I experienced it and think of it. Okay, so you're the team, your team is on the field trying to defend against the bad guys. And there's several problems. Number one is the bad guys, one of two scenarios. They could be invisible. The other team that you are playing against in the soccer arena may be invisible. You can't see them on the field, which means it's extremely difficult to detect them, and you may not even know, or they might not even be there. It could be that you're defending against an opposing team that's actually not even on the field. You just don't know. It is extremely uncertain as to whether they're out there, and if they are, where they are. You have really no idea, and that's kind of what it feels like. That's sort of one part of it. The other part of it is also that they could be wearing the uniforms of your team, because they're embedded, for example, if you're trying to deal with counterterrorism domestically, they're embedded with your folks. They look like your folks. It's not easy to distinguish who is the good guy and who is the bad guy because they're wearing the same uniform. So this is rather problematic if you're trying to figure out who to deal with. It's worse than that, though. So you guys, if you're the counterterrorism folks, you're trying to deal with this, and you're wearing the uniforms, and you got your structure, and people have positions on the field that they have to play, and you've all agreed on that. And sometimes people try to encroach in different people's positions, and you get in disagreements with that, and that all happens. The bureaucratic infighting happens most definitely. But you are trying to follow a set of rules that are established in a variety of different ways, and in theory are consistent with the laws of soccer, right? Soccer, you don't have rules, you have laws. They call them the laws of soccer. So you're trying to adhere to the laws of soccer. This other team, which may or may not be there, which may or may not be wearing your uniforms, really does not have to follow any rules. So these nice little lines that you've got on the field and the way that you set up plays and you can't touch the ball with your hands and that type of stuff, they don't care about that. They don't care about that. They're not following any rules whatsoever. In fact, to go back to the first analogy of just kicking the ball into the goal, they don't even have to stay within the lines on the field, and they can achieve their objective by going around behind the goal, lifting up the net and shoving the ball underneath from the back, right? They have achieved their goal. They have totally violated whatever rules, whatever conceptualization you had of how this is supposed to be done, and they've achieved their objective. They don't really care how they did it, but they've done it. So it's pretty bad. But it's even worse, because if you layer in technology and the changes that are constantly coming at us in terms of technology, both from the perspective of just the world is changing and different, and people, regular people, innocent people, society is using technology in a variety of different ways. The bad guys are using technology in lots of different ways. They're being very creative because they're trying to do a better job of avoiding detection by you. So that makes it harder. And you're drowning in data, and you're trying to figure out how to access this data that you've got available to you, because you know if you don't use it in the right way, you're going to be blamed. And in addition, you're going to be blamed if something bad happens. And in addition, the cybersecurity environment is terrible, and there's all kinds of problems and threats, and you can't keep your data or your system secure. So back to the soccer field, if you add on the reality of technology, it's as though the soccer field itself, with all these problems I described, is now moving and undulating in unpredictable ways. And you're trying to play the game. You're trying to play a defensive game to try to deal with these adversaries that may or may not be there and may be wearing your uniforms. So that's, at least in my mind, what it's like. I used to coach soccer, so this resonates significantly with me. So if that is how it is, then how do you, in an effort to protect privacy, civil liberties, and human rights, how do you go about assisting the team on the field that's trying to deal with this reality, and yet at the same time make sure that they're conducting those activities pursuant to the rule of law? And that's what I think in terms of protecting civil liberties, privacy, and human rights. It's all about protecting, it's about conducting intelligence activities under the rule of law. And the reason I focus on intelligence activities is because it seems to me, the main driver of effective counterintelligence operations counterterrorism operations. The main driver of counterterrorism operations is to have effective intelligence, to be an organization. This is what we aspire to at the FBI, to protect the American people. This was our mission: protect the American people and uphold the Constitution. Right? Do those things simultaneously: protect people, provide security, and yet have freedom and privacy and all the other rights that are enshrined in the Constitution and the laws of the United States, and to try to do those things simultaneously. And to do that, we strove to be intelligence-driven. So how do you collect this intelligence in this environment? How do you think about that? So to me, I think it's very important to think about, with respect to counterterrorism, and to have and to drive operations by having a clear sense of the goals that you're trying to achieve, and then having clear authorities that you have in order to be able to achieve those goals, and clear limitations on them, limitations on what you're able to do. To me, that is what intelligence under law is about. To me, that is what the rule of law is about. People throw around the term the rule of law quite frequently, and there's a lot of definitions, but I tend to think about it in terms of having clear the need for society, and including counterterrorism operations, counterterrorism agencies, to have clear, understandable rules that apply to everyone and produce just outcomes. To me, that's how I think about the rule of law. And when you're trying to conduct operations and when you're trying to conduct oversight, it's critical to have clear rules And it's critical to have clear limitations on what it is that you can do. And I think one of the problems that we have had over the years in the United States is that what we think is clear turns out not to be so clear. What we think are clear laws tend to not be so clear, that there's disagreements about what the laws were actually intended to cover. There's disagreements about what they mean. There's disagreements about how to apply them in new contexts. There's disagreements about how to apply them to new technologies. And so anyway, that's it. Clarity, the operators and the oversight folks need clarity, and that is not actually easy to obtain. Just move quickly here. So, intelligence officials need to collect intelligence through a variety of different ways in order to protect society. So there will be electronic surveillance. There will be confidential human sources. There will be undercover operations. There will be captures and detention of people. There will be successes, and there will be failures, and there will be leaks with respect to all this. So I think on the one hand, we have to recognize that all of these things are going to happen. On the other hand, I think at least in liberal democracies, we have to recognize that, as someone said earlier about Confucius, that one of the central parts about governance is maintaining the trust of the people over the long term. And so that's hard to do. And right now, I think post-Snowden, I think that's been a significant issue that has hindered and made it more complicated, hindered the ability of governmental entities to conduct effective counterterrorism operations dealing with this crazy technological environment that we're in. But let me just go very narrow for a second, and then I'll wrap up. So in terms of conducting effective counterterrorism oversight to make sure that we're protecting privacy, civil liberties, and human rights, I think you need four things at least. These are four key things. You need more than this, but at least a few things. Number one is you need to have effective management of counterterrorism agencies. It starts with the people who are in charge of these agencies. They are the first line of defense in making sure that the laws are adhered to, whatever those laws may be, and hopefully they're clear. And they're the ones that set the goals for the agencies as they are set for them by the laws, the Constitution, other outside organizations. You need to effectively manage. You need to have accountability within organizations. You need to have transparency within organizations so that leaders can understand what the heck is going on the, at the field level. If you don't have that, if the managers are not running their organizations effectively, you're basically doomed. You do need clear laws, and I mentioned that a little bit, and I won't go into it too much. And you need to have them across all the different elements of the intelligence cycle, the establishing requirements for intelligence, collection, analysis and production, and dissemination of information. You need to have clear rules with respect to all that are sensible, that allow for operators to actually get their jobs done, and that are continuously improved over time, because this is not a static environment that we're dealing with. The third thing is you need the right people in these jobs. The people actually matter. These are governments of people. They're not yet. We're not ruled by the AI yet. But so you have to have the right people in the jobs with the right values, the right abilities, the right skills, and you have to have the right culture in these organizations. The culture of a counterterrorism organization is critically important, especially the culture with respect to protecting civil rights, privacy, et cetera. And the fourth thing is that you do need outside oversight. You must have that, and it must be effective, and it must be conducted by people who actually know how these things are done. If you don't have that, if people are so detached and removed from how actual counterterrorism operations are done, they're not going to know what questions to ask, they're not going to know where to look, they're not going to know what rock to turn over to understand that. If you don't have that, if you don't have meaningful, robust oversight, then it is extremely difficult for organizations for us to protect privacy, civil liberties, and human rights. It has to be transparent, it has to be meaningful, it has to be efficient, and it has to be sustained. So you need both the internal controls, external controls, clear rules. Those, I think, are what the essence of being able to both simultaneously deal with the soccer scenario that I laid out, and yet making sure that the team is doing what you want them to do. So with that, I'll pause and turn it back over to everybody else.
Hi, I'm Ji-Hyang from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. And first of all, I'd like to express my deep gratitude toward Dr. Chung Park and the Brookings Institution for giving me this really exciting opportunity to talk about Korea and terrorism. So actually, my topic is about implication of Korea's CV policy for the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, and probably for the international community. But before I go to the main topic, let me briefly present about the relationship between Korea and terrorism, or crucial relevance between CVE, countering violent extremism, and Korea. Because in Korea, we don't have many returning jihadists, and we don't have to worry about valid evidence collected from Syria and Iraq to prosecute the jihadists. And we don't have to worry about reintegration, rehabilitation for the returning jihadists. But we do have crucial issue related to the countering violent extremism in 3 different ways. Okay, first, Koreans got and is getting terrorist attack not inside Korea but outside. Okay, somehow we have very small, tiny Muslim community inside Korea. We have 150,000 Muslims, and actually we have really small number of foreigners, like 2 million foreigners, accounting only for 4% out of entire population, 50 million. Maybe because our immigration policy is more like assimilation rather than multicultural and like a tolerance-driven one. So we have very homogeneity character inside Korea. But because of North Korea, which kind of landlocked South Korea, we should go out. So we went out through the export-oriented economy policy. So many Koreans travel all over the world so intensively, and many Koreans do our own business in outside Korea. And many Korean students are studying abroad, indeed. So we have many Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Kia companies all over the world, and especially in the Middle East. And that's why so many Korean civilians, especially business people, fell victim to the Islamic extremist terrorism. So we do have crucial relevance with the violent extremism. And secondly, many of us might know that these days the ISIS people are not really religious one. I mean, they are different from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda dying to win, but for the ISIS, they just dying for nothing. I mean, they're just dying without any particular reason. So we know that the root cause of recent youth radicalization is not really related to Islamic ideas per se. Let me take an example of ISIS. ISIS is a multinational, multilingual, multi-ethnic terrorist group. All the grassroots people, members of the ISIS, came from over 90 different countries. And they don't know how to read Quran, and they have no idea what the Islam is per se. And maybe that's why we defeated the central leadership of ISIS so easily, meaning that the ISIS grassroots members, they became the member through internet by self-selecting and bottom-up recruitment mechanism. So they really don't care about central leadership. They don't respect the hierarchy. And they don't really listen to the order system inside ISIS. One of their main culture, if there's any, is internet egalitarianism. They just go out, operate, terrorist attacks, very sporadic way, and then after they finish operating the attack, they might or might not report to the central leadership that they did. So, given that the current violent extremism is not really related to religion or Islam, many of us in Korea are worrying that like young Koreans who call their home country as unescapable hell dynasty due to the crazy intensive extremism, extreme competition and high suicide rates and entrenched inequality might turn out to be violent extremism through internet. So it's not really visible yet, but we are also really ready. Preparing for playing soccer with invisible team player. And the third point is that Korea just wants to be a global actor who is responsible. So we decided to join the anti-ISIS global coalition back in 2014. Back then, the member was like 64, but now we have 79 members of anti-ISIS global coalition. And in 2014, the ISIS listed Korea as one of the crusader target. So we really have crucial relevance between ISIS or violent extremism. And let me move on to the main point finally. Okay, I have 2 points to cover. The first one is Korea's cooperation with the international community to combat terrorism. And second point is about how local authorities can enhance the effort of national, regional, and international policy to CVE. Okay, the answer to the first question is nicely related to the third point that I just talked about. Korea wants to be a responsible global leader or player. Okay, we wanted to do that because we wanted to show, to the international community that we do respect the international norms and principles, and we are ready to really uphold, the liberal international order. And there's a little bit, competition going on as well with Japan, which is a very healthy one, not really crazy, extreme one. So we have a little competition which facilitates our activity more in global coalition and international community. And the third one, maybe which is most important, we really wanted to uphold our international norms and principles and wanted to really stick to the liberal international order, because otherwise we will encounter setback when we are dealing with North Korea and the Korean Peninsula issue. Because we know that we really need to have the international support and legitimacy when we are dealing with the Korean Peninsula issue. So it's not really about investment or something, but we are trying so hard to stick to the international liberal order because we are dealing with North Korea. And as for this Korea's cooperation with the international community, there are kind of ongoing disputes regarding the issue, 2 of them. First one, how can we help the Syrian people without helping Bashar al-Assad regime? Korea's international cooperation role is limited to humanitarian assistance provider. We are not really fighting on the battlefield. And we are worrying about that issue because, again, this is a little bit related to the Korean Peninsula issue. Okay, we are keenly observing the rise of Iranian hegemony right after the defeat of ISIS and then the victory of Assad regime after, not really after, but so in the end of Syrian civil war. Okay, the regional power configuration in the Middle East after the ISIS, after the combat against ISIS, is led by Iran and Russia and supported by Turkey and China. And especially we are really witness that there is, the presence of Iranian hardliners, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, in, Sana'a and Baghdad and Beirut and Gaza Strip, not to mention the Damascus. Okay, we are worrying because those, pro-Iranian hardliners forces in Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Gaza Strips are just good customer for the illegal, weapon selling of the North Korean regime. So, given that critical, analysis or observation, again, how can we help the Syrian people without helping Bashar Assad, which is just such a good friend of, Iranian hardliners? So, but then we know that we need to serve our role as a humanitarian assistance provider for the humanitarian disaster in Syria. So one of the alternative could be the demining project for the northeastern Syria, where still the U.S. Army is locating and occupying. So we are thinking about that particular project to help Syrian people. And the second kind of ongoing dispute regarding our role as a humanitarian assistance provider is that, again, it's really, this one is also related to the Korea's position and Korea's national interest as well. Under Trump administration, many, kind of U.S. allies are observing that, these days allies often are treated as, free rider or abandoned or kind of treated as a disposable one. And we saw that evidence when we look at the Peshmerga by the KRG, Kurdish Regional Governors. We are specifically interested in the fate of KRG because during the Iraq War, we stationed in KRG. So I know that KRG did a little bit mistake because the U.S. and other, allies highly discouraged them to have independence referendum election last year, but they did. And then they got kind of abandoned despite all the contribution they made in the war against ISIS. So, okay, the alliance is quite important when, especially we talked about, some countries' cooperation with the international community. So that kind of, evidence or case is like discussed during the think tank community inside Korea. And my last point, which is not really long, is about how local authorities can, reinforce the international and national efforts. Okay, before even Mr. Kim Jong-yang, a Korean, was elected as the chief of Interpol, I heard several times from my Interpol colleagues that Korea is very good at, sharing information and sharing data. So far, we deported 60-some foreigners who had a connection with the extremist groups, and then we arrested about 6 who had strong ties with Al-Nusra Front, And we found out that 7 foreigners who left Korea and then later joined the ISIS. And those achievement was possible thanks to the information sharing between Interpol and Korean authorities. So, I mean, maybe you got bored, but I wanted to, again, emphasize that the information sharing between local authorities and international community and international authorities is really crucial. So that's the thing. But surprisingly or not surprisingly, I heard that the main problem between the cooperation problems mostly come from the internal administrational dispute or rivalry inside the country. So when I had a conversation with my colleagues from European countries and the United States or from the Middle East, they always complaining about the inter-agency or inter-administrational dispute, friction, and rivalry. And Korea is not an exceptional case. And in Korea, we have 5 different agencies dealing with the same issue, CVE. We have ministries of Foreign Affairs and National Defense, and also NIS, National Intelligence Service, and National Police Agency, and Director Moon's the Counterterrorism Center under PM's office. And not surprising, they're fighting. And that's not new. And I even witnessed that even inside foreign ministries, I mean, I often work with foreign ministry people, so I see more the mistake from them. Even inside the foreign ministry, there's no really coherent, policy toward CVE. For instance, like foreign ministry really wanted to, secure the citizens abroad. So they said that try not to, provoke terrorists. So why don't we kind of hide our active, global coalition cooperation effort because, don't mess with the terrorism. So that could be the problem as well. So let me wrap up. Okay, we are fighting a very difficult combat. It is difficult because, democracy is such a feasible target for those violent extremists because we have open systems. So we really do not put, QR code on everybody's household gate. And we have obligation to protect our citizens' security and also privacy. So it's quite challenging. But my presentations, summary could be that, okay, the fight against ISIS is done, and then the Bashar Assad became a winner. Not surprisingly, Iran and Russia became the winner, and China and Turkey are helping them, and Koreans are really worrying because we know that there's strong connection between those bad guys in the Middle East and someone in North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jiang.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's been a real pleasure to, don't worry about it, it's fine, to be invited. My general disclaimer that I am here in my own capacity. I do not represent the Department of Defense or the U.S. National War College. I study Southeast Asian militant groups, and so I do thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk more comparatively about what works in terms of counterterrorism. Terrorism in Southeast Asia is a persistent, but it's a very manageable threat, and I don't want to blow it out of proportion. And the other thing that we need to always think about is the fact that terrorism and terrorist groups are in constant flux. And there are 5 things I'd like to quickly put out there that we need to always be thinking about. How the threat of terrorism in Southeast Asia has metastasized since its al-Qaeda origins with Jemaah Islamiyah into pro-Islamic state groupings. We also have to think about the implications of the loss of the caliphate in Iraq and Syria and how that is going to impact Southeast Asia as the Islamic State morphs into this global insurgency model. What does that mean for Southeast Asia? There was a recent declaration of an East Asian wilayat or province of the caliphate. We're still waiting to see how that manifests in Southeast Asia, but it has some implications to be sure. We also don't really know how the loss of the top 4 Southeast Asian leaders in Iraq and Syria is going to manifest in the region. They have been replaced by the B team. They have less following, less importance in terms of controlling networks, social networks, financial networks. And then finally, we're always trying to determine what do we mean by foreign fighters in Southeast Asia. Are we talking about the North African suicide bomber in Basilan very recently in the Philippines? Or are we simply talking about Malaysians and Indonesians making their way into Mindanao? I want to focus my comments on 2 countries. I could talk much more broadly in Southeast Asia, but I want to stay focused on Indonesia and the Philippines, kind of bookends on what works and what doesn't always work there. Indonesia has had actually superlative counterterrorism since the Bali bombing in 2002. I can really not think of any country that has done a better job in countering terrorism, mitigating the threat, while at the same time defending the rule of law and democracy. And this is in a very fragile new democracy. Don't forget, Suharto fell in 1998 and had a very messy transition to democracy. 4 or 5 presidents in 4 or 5 years. It was a lot of turmoil. Indonesia has arrested around 800 people since 2002 and put almost all of them on trial. So this has really helped build up the rule of law and build up the judiciary in the country. Now, the attack that Ms. Hori mentioned earlier this morning in Surabaya last May, the suicide bombings, this was an unprecedented attack. It included the first female suicide bombers in Southeast Asia, not to mention their children, down to 7 years old. It was a horrific attack. It was the catalyst for many new policies. A counterterrorism bill had stalled in the Indonesian parliament for many reasons. And then kind of after the attack, it was railroaded through. Now, the CT law, the new one, has some positive aspects. It criminalizes joining terrorist groups overseas. So until that point, you could be an Indonesian. You could go and join ISIS in Syria, and that was not a crime. So all of a sudden, that is a crime. They lengthen jail terms for prison sentences. This might not seem like a big deal, but if you think about the Bali bombing that 202 people were killed in back in 2002, other than the 3 top guys who were executed, every other person that was arrested in conjunction with that terrorist attack is free right now. So prison sentences in Indonesia have been very short, and so we're going to see longer sentences. Many more tools for financial investigations, and this is very important. Governments in Southeast Asia were very slow to understand the importance of financial intelligence units in countering terrorism. Indonesia finally has really started to appreciate the use of those tools. We've also seen that the court has banned the umbrella organization for Islamic State in Indonesia. Now, I can argue that that's counterproductive, and but it does give authorities new tools. And we've also seen Indonesia really get far more resources for their elite counterterrorism police that was established in 2002. And this was so important because the Indonesian National Police, until 1999, was actually part of the military. And it was very martial, it was very corrupt. And so the United States, with the help of Australia and Japan, put together this independent policing unit. Very, very high levels of esprit de corps, professionalism. They were very well paid. They did a fantastic job. But there are also controversial provisions to the new law. The ability to strip citizenship, I have fundamental problems with as both a human right, but do we really want these itinerant jihadis roaming around? I am concerned about the increased use in preventative detention, and I am very concerned, especially for the sake of democratization, that the new law gives the Indonesian military a formal counterterrorism role. And it's necessary in certain places, I understand that, but I also see it as part of a larger process of the Indonesian military trying to claw back many of the political powers and economic powers that they have lost since 1998. And I think it certainly plays into the jihadist narrative that the state is oppressive and anti-Islamic. Now, the new powers, and with those new powers, since Surabaya, you've had the arrest of almost 200 people. Now, that might sound good, except it reinforces the salience of prison reform. And I can think of no country that needs prison reform more than Indonesia. First of all, prisons remain very permissive environments in Indonesia. The top 2 Islamic State leaders are in prison in Indonesia, and they still get their sermons out, they still recruit, and they still are able to orchestrate attacks from behind bars. Twice in 2018, IS convicts took over prisons in the country. Now, the first time might be forgivable. The second time, we've got a larger problem here. Indonesian CVE programs are actually quite good. They're very different than Malaysia's or Singapore's, which I'd be happy to discuss in Q&A. But Indonesia also has very limited resources for these types of programs. And on top of those short prison sentences so far, they have very little in the way of post-release monitoring authorities. There's no system of parole. The police are simply spread too thin to deal with these things. Now, another thing that we've seen in Indonesia of late is a willingness to take on big technology. Indonesia is not a small country, and people are very actively involved in social media. Telegram was the big player in terms of being the forum of choice for jihadists. In July 2017, the government threatened to shut Telegram down until they shut down certain channels, and Telegram actually complied and shut down 55 channels. Indonesia forced Telegram to open an office in the country, and this is what Ms. Sachs was talking about before in terms of data localization. Now, all of a sudden, when Telegram does not comply, they have legal skin in the teeth. You have executives that can be hauled to jail. So there are different tools they can do. There are still limits to what we can expect in going after the big tech and social media, simply because there are too many technical workarounds, mirroring, encryption, etc. I have other concerns about Indonesia. There are around 600 Indonesians in Iraq and Syria, many of whom are women and children. They brought entire families. So what does it mean when we start to get those reintegrated back into Indonesia? They really haven't thought this through very well. They've had other problems. The group, not everyone in JI, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, joined Islamic State. JI's social networks are very robust in the country. As the government, we would say, they're left of boom. They're not engaging in violence, and the government has given them enormous space. But their social networks, their mosques, madrasas, kinship ties are still very strong. They're lying low right now because they're just letting the IS groups take the body blows. The government policies on Shia sects and other what are called deviant sects is not helping the matters. Indonesia used to be a very tolerant and pluralist place. It's much less so right now. Now, I'd like to end Indonesia on hopeful points. First of all, I give inordinate credit to the Indonesians for the social resiliency they have in terms of dealing with terrorism. Islam in Indonesia traditionally has been very syncretic. It's built upon a very rich Hindu culture. While Salafism is growing in the country, and it is growing, there is still a lot of pushback. Just yesterday, the Saudi ambassador really put his foot in it when he called the Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the largest Muslim organization in the world, a deviant organization. That is going to cause a huge pushback. That same ambassador just today was shown embracing one of the Bali bombers, Abu Jabril, one of the founders of JI, causing a huge uproar. The other thing, though, is some of the creativity in countering violent extremism. And I'd like to point attention to two schools that have gone up. The Indonesian government has allowed schools for terrorist children. And in fact, one of these schools was founded by a terrorist suspect from behind bars. He went to the head of the counterterrorism authorities and said, listen, we've got a problem. I'm in jail. No one's taking care of my kids. They're going to resort right back into IS or JI social networks. We've got to get them out of these mosques and madrasas. And they set up a school where all these children from terrorists, including one of the survivors of the Surabaya bombing, a young little girl, are now being educated at the expense of the state. Now, I really would love to see any discussion of that getting through the FBI's legal office. There's no way in hell we would ever countenance something like that. But it's very creative in saying we've got to get out of these social networks. Let me move on to the Philippines, because the Philippines is very important, not just for the sake of security of the Philippines, which is a treaty ally of the United States, but more broadly, because what happens in the Philippines does not stay in the Philippines. The Philippines has much broader regional security implications. We found that when terrorists need place to lie low or train or prepare other attacks in the region, they do so from the Philippines, simply because there is so much, maybe not ungoverned space, but very poorly governed space. There is an alphabet soup of different groups in the southern Philippines. Secessionists, terrorists, but this very confusing pattern, and I've spent 25 years studying these groups, and it still confuses me sometimes. It's very easy for different organizations to come in and graft on, to manipulate them and use them for their own purposes. We saw in 2017 a 5-month siege of the city of Marawi, taken over by Islamic State militants or pro-Islamic State militants. And this really just underscores the ongoing weaknesses and capacity of the Philippine security forces. The other important thing to note about the siege of Marawi was it was the first time that I can really think of that you had two different militant groups there that worked together. Luckily, even though we have this alphabet soup of different groups, they tend to be very divided by ideology or ego, more likely. And so they've just been, we've never had to confront our real fears that these groups would start to act as one. And luckily, they've been so divided that they've been a manageable threat. Let me also mention the fact that the Philippines, because of the ungoverned space, really matters as IS morphs into this global insurgency. You cannot be a province of the caliphate unless you actually have territory. And you can have IS cells in Malaysia or across Indonesia, but nowhere in the region other than the Philippines can these groups actually physically control space. And that in itself will be a draw. We have seen, is that me or you? I hope it's me. We have seen these groups, or the Islamic State, for years, going back to 2014, tell militants, if you can't make it to the Islamic State caliphate in Iraq and Syria, make your way to Mindanao. And they have been doing this. And so Mindanao will continue to be a draw. And I think that one of the reasons why it's so important, it's not that these foreigners can come in and necessarily have more expertise, bomb-making expertise. The most important thing that these foreigners bring in is some credibility, sometimes financial ties, but most importantly, they are able to bridge some of those parochial divides we see that divide Filipino groups. The last thing we need to talk about in terms of countering terrorism is to think about the maritime domain. We might not think about this in other parts of the world, but in Southeast Asia, the maritime domain is absolutely critical. The tri-nation border region between the Philippines, Malaysia, and Singapore is really critical. We're seeing that's how foreign fighters get into Mindanao. It's how militants get in and out. But on top of that, we've also seen a spate of maritime shipjackings and kidnappings, which helps fund terrorist operations. And because this, the organizers from Northeast Asia, let me kind of conclude on this tie-in to that. From March 2016 to the end of the year, would you just stop it? Damn technology. I have no idea what it is. It's not even online. In March 2016 to the end of the year, we saw a spate of maritime kidnappings. Most of it was Indonesian and Malaysian fishermen, tugboats bringing coal from Indonesia up into the southern Philippines. But all of a sudden, the shipjackers started to get a little bit better and a little bit cockier. And they took over a South Korean cargo vessel, kidnapping their captain. They went after larger ocean-going Vietnamese ships, and they also tried to board a Japanese ship. Luckily, the Japanese crew was able to take evasive actions and repel this. But this is going to have implications for regional security. It's often said that piracy is combated on land. I would make the case that in Southeast Asia, terrorism in many ways is combated at sea. We really need much more in the way of better policing in the maritime domain from those three countries. Unfortunately, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia all have very limited maritime capacity. Outsiders, the Americans, Australians would love to help. The Singaporeans are itching to get in. But right now, unfortunately, we are not able to sufficiently bridge some of the sovereignty issues and challenges there. So let me leave it at that. Thank you very much for having me.
We have about half an hour. Panelists, you'll need to put your microphones back on. We have about half an hour left in this panel. I want to thank the panelists for their very good insights. And since the time is short, I'll just confine myself to one question to you, Jim. Jim, you gave a good list of elements needed to be able to protect privacy, respect human rights, et cetera, while doing counterterrorism. And one of the things that you said was that you need clear laws. And of course, there needs to be a clear understanding about what those laws are. But given the technology and given often the paralysis that we see in this town on Capitol Hill, how hard is it to get the clear laws in a timely fashion for counterterrorism work?
Obviously very hard. I mean, I think that's one of the significant problems that we have, and something that government leaders need to grapple with. I think government leaders in the legislative branch, in the executive branch, in the judicial branch, really across the board, all struggle with understanding what the technology is, what it means, and well, what it is. That's hard enough to understand, and then what implications it has for how adversaries are using it, and then how we deal with it, what data is being generated, and then how best to control that. So I think, quite frankly, organizations like Brookings and other organizations need to help show the way forward, to come up with creative ideas, to help them understand what's going on, come up with creative ideas to do it. But the process, the laws, as other people have observed, in the United States, the laws that protect our privacy are a complex patchwork of rules that really don't address these issues adequately. And I think, quite frankly, now the Europeans are way out ahead of the United States in terms of thinking about privacy. There are efforts ongoing in the U.S. to try to change that. California has a new statute. There's work to try to come up with a federal statute, but it's a lot of work, but it needs to be done. But it's not something, as you alluded to, it's not something you can just do it and then forget about it. You're going to have to keep up with it because technology is just moving so quickly.
Well, thank you. We have one question here from our chair.
Thanks so much. I really like Jim's the analogy to the soccer game, and that was in the U.S. context, right? But how do we expand that to the international context, where
I think it applies to
so
everybody.
not everybody's playing by even though the people on your team are not playing by the same type of rules, and worries about sovereignty, what liberal democracy is, what kind of governance methods you use. So how does that work when at multiple levels you have conflict? Dr. Jiang talked about the silos and the bureaucratic infighting. Jeff, in his comments, in his introductory comments, talked about the problems that the UN saw in trying to get everybody in herding cats, and to deal with the individuals' countries' concerns about independence. And so I was wondering if the speakers, from the Southeast Asian perspective, from the South Korean perspective, who should lead, and how do you make sure that everybody's playing by the same type of rules?
I think Mr. Baker's the analogy of soccer game to the CVE is really perfect. Okay, for instance, when we are talking about the players, we really do not include, the non-members of the 79 anti-ISIS global coalition. We do not have, Chinese player, Russian player, or others who really, don't want to respect the international, norms and principles and liberal order, and not to mention Iran, Syrian. But we do have 74 countries and 5 international organizations. And when we limit the members or players to the 79, the anti-ISIS global coalition, then his analogies applies perfectly. So,
I would say it's not just silos, but the silos are real, and competition over scarce resources reinforce those silos. But it also makes international cooperation, and there has to be international cooperation because it's a transnational threat. Those silos make international cooperation harder, and we're going from country to country with their different political, social, legal cultures can often make it very hard to find appropriate organizations as counterparts with similar legal authorities, right? So Malaysia and Singapore can cooperate quite well because they have the tradition of the British system of special branch, right? Which has intelligence functions but not policing. That all of a sudden it gets different in other countries. If in the Philippines, where the military really has the primary responsibility, how can the police of other countries correspond? And so we have those problems on top of it. And we just don't have a single really good way for all these different security forces to share information. We certainly know that they're unwilling to share information. We've come a long way since 2002, but still a long way to come. So the silos is a real problem. I'm concerned in Indonesia the silos are actually getting taller and more of them.
Please.
Nirmal Ghosh from the Straits Times. I think I should address this to Zachary. From the earlier panel, Audrey Cronin had mentioned that terrorism is increasingly indivisible from organized crime. And I wonder if you share that assessment and if you could possibly sort of pass it a bit for us. Thanks.
Well, no terrorist group I can think of right now in Southeast Asia has state sponsorship, and so obviously money comes in, and all groups engage in some degree of criminality to support their operations. So there is, at what point is it crime if it's there to support a terrorist operation? And I think when we think about some of the kidnapping in the Sulu Sea, how much of that is done by freelance fishermen who then sell hostages up the chain of command? And let me give you a very clear example of this. They treat Filipinos very differently than they treat Malaysian and Indonesian captives versus Western captives. And we can see it in the price people pay for the ransoms, right? $10,000 for a Filipino, it's $100,000 for Malaysian and Indonesian fishermen, and then boy, once you get some Canadians or Europeans, we're talking millions. So we do have that. I would also go back and look, we had some of this debate and tying it into what Ms. Sachs was really talking about with the Uyghurs. The repression against the Uyghurs in China, we've seen a steady stream of Uyghurs going out via Southeast Asia, Thailand, which you know very well, into Malaysia, and then onward to Turkey, where they've been given more or less sanctuary. And we had the Chinese put a lot of pressure on the Thais, and as you remember, the Thais forced these people, many Uyghurs, back. The women and children, they got out, but they returned the men. And the images of this were very harrowing. The black hoods and 2 policemen per captive on the plane. And these people were more or less never to be seen again back in Xinjiang. There was a terrorist attack in downtown Bangkok, and which was woefully mismanaged by Thai authorities. And a lot of it was pressure from Beijing. And the Thais like to say that it was a revenge attack because we cracked down on human trafficking so effectively. That made no sense. Why would you launch a major terrorist attack in a country whose, the linchpin of the economy is tourism, to protest crackdowns in those networks? So I don't think it's completely indistinguishable. Sometimes I see governments really try to make the link when it doesn't exist.
Let me follow up on that, if I may, Zachary. As opposed to Uyghurs actually leaving and going elsewhere, do you see examples in Asia of the plight of the Uyghurs, the Chinese policies toward Uyghurs inspiring others, or the Rohingya expulsion, or the extremist Buddhist attacks in Kandy, Sri Lanka in March? Do you see these sort of policies inspiring radicalization, extremism, and terrorism?
Let me start with the Uyghurs. I am agog that the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs has not come back to haunt them in any way in Southeast Asia. It really hasn't. And I don't know if that's because China is simply, the reality is they are the largest trading partner of every country in Southeast Asia, and they just have that much leverage, and the promises of BRI and AIIB funding, forces the governments to crack down. Indonesia arrested a number of Uyghurs, small number, but a number of Uyghurs out in a pro-Islamic State grouping, simply because it was easier for them to get there than make their way into Syria, where there's much more attention. China sent their first, the first case I can think of where they sent senior intelligence officials to sit in the courtroom during those proceedings and really try to strong-arm the Indonesian government to render them back to the country. Indonesian government said they would, and yet there's been enough public pressure on them that they haven't so far. Now, the Rohingya is a much bigger issue, and I think this is going to be something to watch down the roads. Both Ayman al-Zawahiri issued a statement after that, pledging revenge on the Myanmar government. That was followed by a mishmash of different responses, competing responses from the Islamic State. But so far, and I chalk it up to nothing more than prejudice, no one has really come to do anything in the name of the Rohingya. We've seen a steady stream of Southeast Asian militants try to get into Bangladesh in solidarity with them. The Malaysians have arrested a number of people en route. The Singaporeans are obviously keeping very close tabs on this. They have a lot of migrant workers from Bangladesh. And have been cracking down on some of the funding flows, the remittances back there. But so far, we haven't seen it. A number of years ago, not that long ago, there was a Rohingya organization that tried to blow up the Myanmar embassy in Jakarta. I imagine that Myanmar assets around the world, assets and interests, will be targeted in the future. So far, we haven't seen it, but it's coming.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi. I also had a question for Zachary. You mentioned that there would be implications of ISIS declaring its East Asia branch an official province. So I was wondering if you could expound a little on what those implications might be and kind of how that will play out with the networks in Southeast Asia's connections back to Syria.
Very good question. Let me start with this. You had all these different groups and cells across Southeast Asia declare bayat to the Islamic State starting in 2014. Islamic State didn't recognize any of them until early 2016. It really took a long time. And I can't tell you why, if it's just racism, or if it was just that the Islamic State was growing so quickly and they were so busy building their caliphate, they didn't even need Southeast Asians. 2016, they recognized them, but they didn't declare the caliphate until this past year. So again, is that part of the fact that, we've lost the caliphate, we've lost 99% of our territory, and we've got to think about a global insurgency model? That could be part of the implications. I've been reading, I don't want to talk trash and be a petty academic. There are some people that see the declaration of the caliphate as much more centralized and dangerous than I think it is. I think it's still very aspirational. I am just not convinced that the declaration of this caliphate is all of a sudden going to unite all these different cells and groups across Southeast Asia into one centrally organized force. I just don't see it. It's never happened before. If history's a guide, it's not going to happen now. It could pave the way for more funding coming in, but again, the top IS militants who have been in Syria, for 4+ years, they've been killed. And it's really a B team. I imagine it matters in terms of propaganda and the narrative, but in some ways, the declaration of this province, show me the results. Now, in terms of real attacks and the ability to challenge states, I don't see it. If anything, it makes me think that the IS is weaker than maybe I thought it was.
Others? Please. So, and then afterwards, just behind. Yeah.
Terry Taylor, thanks for your excellent insights. Every speaker, both in this panel and previously, has stressed the importance of international cooperation. And I wonder if we could explore the character of the most effective form of international cooperation. Having worked within the UN, having been involved in the Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force myself, 38 entities trying to work together. It seems, and we've heard mention of Japan's direct assistance, bilateral assistance, Korea's direct bilateral assistance. It seems to me, as someone who's worked in this area internationally for some years, that is the most effective. It's bilateral assistance, or even sub-regional assistance. Is there a better way we can handle the international cooperation? Obviously, we have to work at the global level and work downwards, and specialist things like the Financial Action Task Force, for example, can be very effective. So either it's bilateral or maybe sub-regional groups plus specialist groups that can make the most effective contribution. Am I right? Or is there more we can do at the global or broader regional level? Thank you.
Dr. Jiang?
So that's comment, right? Was it
Yeah.
this question?
Yeah.
What can we do more effectively at the international, regional, global level in these areas?
I think we are in a good shape.
I'm a moderator, but I'm a moderator, so I probably shouldn't jump in here. But following up on your comment, if I may, one thing that frustrated me when I was in the counterterrorism positions in the UN as part of my Undersecretary General position was there's all this flurry of activity to pass Security Council resolutions on various aspects of counterterrorism, whether it's API or other issues. There's no follow-up. There's no follow-up. That the countries that are sponsoring these in the Security Council will get all excited to get support for whatever the particular initiative is, and then they move on to something else, where there should be the type of pressure on countries to comply with these Security Council resolutions that are usually passed under Chapter 7. They're obligatory. And when you do a survey of how have these counterterrorism conventions resolutions been implemented, there's enormous gaps in countries. And yet there's no reputational risk to the country of not complying.
If I could just interject, I mean, I don't know if it's a direct answer to your question, but I think that what actually happens is that the entities within governments that have the greatest incentives, because they have the greatest risk and the greatest responsibility, to make sure that there is cooperation are the agencies with sort of the boots on the ground, so to speak, both domestically and foreign. So, for example, intelligence and law enforcement entities have extremely robust relationships with each other that have developed over time, that are sustained over time, because they have the need and the incentive to sustain those. And those are not visible to most people. Those are not visible. There's not a big show about them. There's not big pronouncements about them. They're not big international conferences or whatever. They are sustained relationships that have existed for a long period of time that are effective. Now, there are significant, I think, over recent time, the technology piece that we've talked about, I think that raises a significant issue for them as data is located in one location or another, and the local laws prevent or make it more difficult for foreign entities, for example, to get data from the United States. That's been a particular issue over time, and a sort of a thorn in the side of the relationships, I would say. But I think focusing more on those, making sure that those are robustly supported, over time, I think is going to be, that's what's actually happening, I think, not regardless, that's sort of what the undercurrent, regardless of what's happening at the wave tops.
Professor Rubin?
I think regional leadership matters in many ways more than kind of the global top-tier leadership. In Southeast Asia, if Indonesia is not willing to take the lead on something, it really doesn't happen. And right now they're in a very reticent political mood. There was very little counterterrorism cooperation before Bali. After Bali, Indonesia took the lead, and they could. That's one thing to think about. But going back to bilateral cooperation, sometimes that can be very counterproductive. Look at what the Americans have done in the Philippines. It creates at some point moral hazard. Does the Philippine military, even with their increased $4.4 billion budget, 85% of that goes to personnel costs. They have challenges of trying to modernize to deal with China, even if Duterte is not going to stand up to China and press their claim. What incentive do they have to finish off the Abu Sayyaf? They have $50 million a year in U.S. counterterrorism assistance. After Marawi, the Singaporeans are pouring money in, the Australians are pouring money in, the EU is pouring money in. And sometimes we create these moral hazards. We're too quick with a checkbook. I really don't think we do a very good job at holding countries accountable and having benchmarks.
Yes, Dr. Chang.
The reason I was a little cynical about the further international cooperation to combat terrorism is because, again, these days, those ISIS guys are not really, visible, target or enemy. The ISIS is different from Al-Qaeda, and therefore they are different from, Mujahideen or the Muslim Brotherhood, meaning that, we need to look at the weakest link of domestic power structures or domestic issues. For instance, in the United States, you don't have many, returning jihadists, but rather you have a homegrown, extremists who had guns. And we Koreans do not have such issues, but we will be going to have, those homegrown violent extremist issues sometime soon. We are sure that. So, the fight against violent extremism these days is different from the fight against Al-Qaeda. The ISIS problem is more related to each individual country's domestic structure. So I agree with you saying that, the U.S. bilateral financial assistance might be counterproductive. Again, the problem should be solved inside out.
I think we have time for one more question. Please.
Sir, you mentioned the Indonesia CT laws recently changing. There may be room in there for more military involvement by Indonesia in domestic counterterrorism. So I'll pose that question specific to Indonesia, but also writ large as for Mr. Baker as well. In terms of judicial end states and the military involvement in counterterrorism in Southeast Asia, what are your thoughts?
In Indonesia, in certain cases, it is appropriate. For example, one of the first groups that kind of morphed from JI into Islamic State was based in central Sulawesi. And this place is very important to the narrative, the Mujahideen Indonesia Timur. The police weren't going to go in. I mean, it's just dense jungle. It's like, hell no, we're not going in. That's an appropriate role for the military. But when you see it as part of an overall paradigm where the Minister of National Defense is talking about Bella Negara and trying to get the military back into things like food security and politics and trying to wrest back political authorities, I'm concerned. I really worry about blowback and overreach and just competition with the police. They see a lot of money in counterterrorism and want in. It adds to the legal issues. At what point can they arrest people? Do they have to have in-beds with the Indonesian National Police embedded with them? They haven't thought these things through yet. And I really worry. The Indonesian military does not have a great human rights record. Not that the police does, but it's better and improving. And I really think if we don't have these commitments to rule of law, the Philippines has had a military-first strategy, and it's been a disaster. The Philippines just, in 2018, is just as bad as it was in many ways in 2001. And we are committed, and I say this as a DoD employee, I am the turd in the punch bowl when it comes to this, that we keep on supporting the AFP, regardless of their human rights abuses, regardless of whether they're willing to use artillery as a counterterrorism tactic, shelling, which is why Marawi looked like Mosul. This is not smart. And at the same time, there's very little accountability of the military, very little oversight, which is so important.
Jim?
Yeah, so just a few comments. So as someone who is a huge supporter of the U.S. military, I will also say that if the military has to come in and deal with a counterterrorism issue, then it represents a failure of the civilian agencies, right? So to me, I think the civilian agencies need to get their act together and avoid forcing upon the military, that's kind of how I think of it, the responsibility to come in and deal with the situation. So that's sort of number one. The civilian agencies should be the first line of defense, and I include both law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and those relationships that I was mentioning earlier with the local authorities to make sure that we're providing whatever information, assistance, training, resources, so that the local authorities can deal with it. That's sort of one thing. Number two is, I think in terms of bringing in the military, obviously it has to be lawful. And so it has to be lawful under domestic law and under international law. If the country consents to it, then that probably deals with the international aspect of that. But what is the authority that the United States has to put our folks at risk in these areas? I mean, that there has to be, at least seems to me, a clear authorization from Congress to be able to do that. So it's just, I believe that. Related to that, I mean, having a clear, everybody knows this, you know this in the military much better than I do, you have to have a clear mission. Like, what is the mission? What is the objective? What are the measurables? What are the milestones that you're going to try to achieve in this kind of environment before we go getting involved in that? And I think that's something that we, unfortunately, we don't do it uniformly. We need to, and if we're going to put forces in, we need to have clear objectives. And the third thing, I guess, is if the U.S. forces are going to be involved, it seems to me that's more, in this kind of environment, perhaps a role for U.S. Special Forces to assist the training, the development of the local forces, and let them deal with the problem. Provide them the expertise so that they can, intelligence, training, to be able to deal with the problem on their own, and as opposed to making this some type of U.S. military lead in any way, at least that I've heard about, and I don't pretend to be an expert in Southeast Asia, but those are some of the things that I would worry about.
Thank you. I'd like to invite you all to join me in thanking our panelists, Jim Baker, Ji-Hyang, and Zachary Abuza, for a very interesting exchange. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.